Thanks, Mike, and good evening, everybody. So yes, we're going to spend some time thinking about Bible prophecy and the nations of Europe. And we had Ezekiel chapter 38 read. We're going to spend time looking in Ezekiel chapter 38 to see what we can see about what the Bible says about things which are going to happen in the future. We read in, was it verse 8? It was verse 8 of Ezekiel chapter 38. That says, after many days thou shalt be visited, in the latter years thou shalt come into the land. So Ezekiel is being given a prophecy here of things which were going to happen a long time after Ezekiel's day. And we're going to suggest that these are things that we can see happening today. And what we really want to show is that we're going to put forward an interpretation of what we just read in Ezekiel chapter 38. And we want to show that in light of the events which are happening in the world today, the things that we can see that Ezekiel prophesied about are utterly reasonable, are entirely reasonable for us to understand. And if we do accept that what Ezekiel is writing about are things that happen or are happening and are being fulfilled now, what that tells us is that the Bible contains a very important message for us. It contains a message that can only have come from the God of heaven, who, as Brother Mike has said already, can see things as though they have happened, even though they have not happened yet. So we're going to spend time thinking about Ezekiel and Ezekiel 38. And what we're going to do is show the sequence of events in Ezekiel chapter 38. Just break down what happened in Ezekiel chapter 38. What is it that we just read? Then we're going to think about Gog and his allies. We're going to think about Tarshish and the young lions. And then we're going to come back to the sequence, because what we're going to do is show the sequence from the point of view of Ezekiel. So the nations and the countries and the kingdoms that Ezekiel talks about. And then we're going to see them in the light of current events and current history. So we will then come back to the sequence. And then we'll think about our own future after that. So the book of Ezekiel, broken down on the screen for you. There's really only one section of this slide that is interesting for us. You can see at the end there, it breaks down the various chapters 1 through to 48 at the end. And we're in chapter 38, obviously, thinking about the restoration of Israel. And that's what we read about in Ezekiel 38. The dealings of the nations with the land of Israel and God's restoring of that country, of that kingdom and of that people. But the interesting thing is the time that we have there. Second row from the bottom tells us that Ezekiel prophesied between 592 and 570 BC. So the things that we are reading in Ezekiel 38 were prophesied of thousands of years ago. 2,500 plus years ago, the prophet Ezekiel was given these words to write. And it's an interesting thing about prophecy, isn't it? That it's very easy to make a prophecy that is so indistinct that it could mean almost anything. And given that, it's then very easy to say, well, it must apply to this event, or it could apply to this, or it could be talking about this thing or that thing. And you could be very non-specific. And there are countless examples of prophecies like that in the world. You may have read, you may not, you probably haven't, and it would be beneficial to you if you didn't. But the prophecies of Nostradamus, for instance, are so oblique. They are so vague and shrouded in sort of fog and obfuscation that they could mean anything. And therefore, you can make them apply to anything and say, well, look at this. He spoke about this event before it happened. When in fact, he was just throwing words at the page. And they happen to possibly be able to be interpreted in a way which fits certain circumstances. The prophecies of the Bible aren't like that. The prophecies of the Bible are specific. We will see there are specific nations mentioned. We will see that there is a specific order of events which is going to happen. We will see that there are specific camps which are set out. And we can be specific about our interpretation of these things. And 2,500 years ago, the man called Ezekiel was given these words to write down by the God of heaven. And we're going to see, or try and provide a foundation for, a principle that the Bible tells us about. So in Daniel chapter 4 and verse 32, we read that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomsoever he will. And what this is telling us, what Daniel was seeing, what King Nebuchadnezzar was being shown, was that the affairs of men, the current events that we see in the world, are not directed by great men or leaders of history. There is a field of historical inquiry called great man theory, whereby history is directed by great men. It is always men, pretty much. And throughout history, great men have existed and have directed the course of history. Napoleon, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar. That's not how history works. The Bible tells us that God is in control, that all of these men are raised up by God, that all of these events happen under the hand and the eye of God. And this is what we're going to see this evening as we think about Ezekiel chapter 38. So, what is the sequence? How does Ezekiel chapter 38 break down? Well, we are told in the first little section about Gog and his allies. So we're introduced to Gog in verse 2, aren't we? It says, "Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog." So we've got a person and his country, a head, a leader, and his area. The land of Magog, told about the prince of Meshech and Tubal. And there is a prophecy that is made against them. And he has various allies. So we have in verse 5, Persia and Ethiopia and Libya, and Gomer in verse 6, and the house of Gomer of the north quarters, and all his bands and many people with thee. So we are told about Gog and a collection of countries. And they invade the land of Israel. Verse 12 tells us that it is to take a spoil, to take a prey, to turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited. And there's an interesting detail, isn't there? Because at the time of Ezekiel, there were people in the land of Israel. And then 500 years or so, 600 years or so later, the Jews were taken out of the land of Israel, and Israel became a desolate place. There was no sort of permanent established inhabitants of the land, and that fluctuated throughout time, and sometimes there were people there and sometimes there weren't. But now, says Ezekiel, that land, the land of Israel, is inhabited again, the desolate places that are now inhabited. And so what Ezekiel is doing is showing us a time when there are people in the land of Israel. It has been desolate, but people have returned. And we can see that today, can't we? We can see a nation in the land of Israel calling themselves Israel. There are another group of nations, aren't there, who set themselves in opposition to this first group of nations. So we have Gog, and we've seen Persia and Ethiopia and Libya, etc. on one side. And then on the other side, we have in verse 13, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish. And they stand in opposition to Gog and his allies. And they ask the question, Are you come to take a spoil? It says in verse 13. They make a protest, but they don't actually stop this invasion. This invasion happens. It's as though the invasion happens, and then this group of countries, Sheba and Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, the young lions, go, what are you doing here? What are you doing in Israel? Following this ineffectual protest, Ezekiel chapter 38 tells us that God intervenes. We read verse 18, didn't we? It shall come to pass at the same time when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, saith the Lord God, that my fury shall come up in my face. And God then is going to intervene. And it's described as God intervening with earthquake and plague and hail and fire. Verse 22 talks about that. And then finally, in verse 23 of Ezekiel chapter 38, we are brought to a situation where all of the nations have clashed, God has intervened. And in verse 23, God will magnify himself. It just means to make himself great. And what it's showing is that nations are going to recognize and acknowledge God, the power of God, the existence of God, the right of God to intervene and to have his standards upheld through the earth. They shall know, says Ezekiel 38 in verse 23, that I am the Lord. And so all of this that happens in Ezekiel 38 happens to bring us to that point. The point where the nations will acknowledge that God exists and that God is in control. All of these things in Ezekiel 38 bring the nations to the point where they see that God rules in the kingdom of men. And that it is God's right to rule. And it begins a process which sets up then what is known in the Bible as the kingdom of God. And we're not going to think about that. We're going to think about the lead up to that this evening. We're not going to think about that particular subject in any detail. But the Bible shows for us the way in which there will come a time when God will rule over the world. And nations will acknowledge him and his rule through the person of the Lord Jesus Christ. So that's the sequence. That's what happens in Ezekiel chapter 38. And there are countries in there and nations in there that are not immediately recognizable to people today. There are a number of places in there that you might not be able to point to on a map because the names have changed. And the people that held certain areas have changed their names over the years. But what we're going to do is spend a little bit of time trying to understand who these nations are. And as we understand who these nations are, we will be better able then to point to the situation of the world today to say, is this a reasonable thing? Can we acknowledge that what we see in Ezekiel chapter 38 is a reasonable position for the world to be in? That's not moving anymore, which is very exciting. Why is it not moving anymore? Nobody knows. Why is it not going? Oh, there we are. So who are we thinking about then? Well, we can break it into two particular groups. There is a group of nations who are against God. And then there are a group of nations who are against the other nations. They aren't working for God specifically or in any understanding that that is what they are doing. They are merely ranged against these other nations. We're going to think about those nations who are against God first of all, because they're the ones that we're first introduced to. So we've got Gog, we've got the land of Magog, we have Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, we have Persia, Ethiopia, Libya, Gomer and Togarmah. Now, you're probably all nervous that we're going to try and go through all of those. We will, but it'll be quick. So we will skip through some of these things. So we are told about Gog of the land of Magog. And we're told in the writings of a Jewish historian who lived in Rome and became a Roman pretty much, called Josephus. He tells us that Magog founded those that from him were named Magogites, but the Greeks called them the Scythians. And that is the generally accepted position of historians, that when we're thinking about Magog here in Ezekiel chapter 38, we are thinking about a group of people who became known as the Scythians. So you can see the history of Russia, that quote at the bottom there by Ryazanovsky, who says that the Scyths ruled southern Russia from the 7th to the end of the 3rd century BC. At its greatest extent, the Scythian state stretched south of the Danube in its western flank and across the Caucasus and into Asia Minor on its eastern. So we are given this picture of a group of people who ruled what was the area of southern Russia for 400 or so years, from the 7th to the end of the 3rd century BC. So we have a group of people then who are based in this area of southern Russia, and they are known as the Scythians. There we have a picture of this particular sort of area that they came in from the east. They migrated across and then set up and expanded across that area of southern Russia. What is the area, the contested area of Ukraine today? And we can see that they expanded out south through the Persian Empire as it was then, all the way down as far as Egypt at one point. And there is evidence of that in place names in Israel. So in Israel there is this place between the Sea of Galilee going down the Jordan River that is called Scythopolis. And it's called Scythopolis because a group of Scythians came down from Russia and came into the area that is Israel today, and they founded a city. And because they weren't very imaginative, they named it after themselves, and so they called it Scythopolis. And so there is the historical background, if you like, to this group of people who Ezekiel refers to as Magog, or the land of Magog, but we see are the Scythians, and the land of Magog then is that area of southern Russia. Whoa. We've gone a very long way forward, no quite right. So in verse 2 of Ezekiel chapter 38, we are introduced to this man called the chief prince, Gog, who is the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Now, chief prince is not a good translation. It's not a good way that this Hebrew should be translated. The Revised Version translates it as the Prince of Rosh. You can see a quotation there from a grammarian called Hitzig, who says that chief prince, that the Hebrew there is an epithet that's formed by the junction of two words in the Hebrew, and you don't find it anywhere else in the Bible in this, or at least translated in this way. The full title, if it were simply a compound title, should be so formally repeated is rather improbable. So the argument is that where it says there in verse 2 that there is the chief prince of Meshech, and then you've got it again in verse 3, the chief prince of Meshech, that it is repeated like that, suggests that this isn't this compound title, chief prince, but is actually describing a person who is the prince of Rosh. And that word Rosh there is the Hebrew word that's translated as chief. But here it's a proper noun. This person is the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. And so the question is, and if you were paying close attention as we skipped back through the slides, you already know the answer. But the question is, who is Rosh? Or where is Rosh? Where is Meshech? Where is Tubal? That they would have a prince over them. It doesn't like moving. So, Rosh, we are told, is the most ancient form under which history makes mention of the name of Russia. From Rosh and Meshech, of whom Ezekiel speaks, descended the Russians and the Muscovites. So we've already seen a connection with the area of Russia in the Scythians and this land of Magog. And here we have that confirmed for us in the fact that we have this prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, and we have an understanding that this is referring to a man who is over the area of Russia, particularly Moscow, which is the sort of the Meshech part of that, and Tubal is considered to be the area around the city of Tobolsk as it is today. And so Ezekiel chapter 38 then is drawing our attention upwards from Israel to the country based up in the north, to the country particularly of Russia. And Gog sits at the head of this great alliance of nations, doesn't it? Persia and Ethiopia and Libya, all of them together, says verse 5. So if we accept the interpretation that the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal is referring to the leader of the Russian people and the nation of Russia, then who are they allied with? Who are they associated with? Who does Ezekiel say they are going to be associated with? And who can we see those associations with today? Well, the first name is Persia in verse 5. And Persia, the area of Persia, is known today as Iran. Iran is the name of the area from which the Persian Empire came, and the area of the world which is associated with that Persian Empire is the country today known as Iran. And of all the allies that Russia has today, the Iranians are some of the staunchest of their allies. As Putin invaded Ukraine, Iran was suggesting that it was as a result of American intervention, that Western support of Ukraine and Western support in Afghanistan had led to this invasion, trying to take attention away from the Russians. At the same time, Russia was speaking to Iran of a nuclear deal, whereby Russia was going to support Iran. This was January of 2022. And Russia again shows its closeness with the Iranians. This was, it says 3 days ago, I think it was Wednesday of this week, where Putin went over to Iran on a rare trip, it says, but where he found a keen ally. So world events would suggest to us that Russia and Persia or Iran are closely associated with each other, that Russia can rely upon the support of Iran. If we were to ask the question at this point, are these things reasonable? Just this association between Russia and Iran, we would have to say yes, just based on the association of those countries at this time. But there are other countries, aren't there? Persia, we are told, and Ethiopia. Now it's this was August of last year. Ethiopia are currently building what they call the GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And they are using Russian support, or there is Russian diplomatic support, with the building of that dam. And it's a massive project that Ethiopia have undertaken because they think it is going to greatly increase their economy and their wealth in their land. And Russia are associated with this. Again, if we apply the is this reasonable test of associating Russia with Ethiopia, we can't but argue that it is reasonable, that this is a reasonable thing. And what about Libya? We have there in verse 5 as well. Again, these are countries that are easier to place than Persia and are going to be easier to place than Gomer and Togarmah slightly later on. But that was Avrov with the Ethiopian foreign minister, I think. In Libya, this was October of 2018, Russia sends troops and missiles into Libya in bid to enforce stranglehold on the West. This was a time when Theresa May was in power. Vladimir Putin wants to make the war-torn North African nation his new Syria. So one of the things that Russia has done in Syria is to destabilize that country and to prop up the current regime so that they are then reliant upon Russia. And it is as though Putin is trying to do the same thing in Libya as well. Now, this was almost 4 years ago now, but the situation is similar today, July of 21, so about a year ago. Will Russian forces really leave Libya? There's a question over whether the forces that Putin put into Libya are ever going to go, whether he is going to leave them there, because the Libyan reliance on Russia is important to him. So again, ask the question, is it reasonable what we see in Ezekiel chapter 38? And the answer is yes. We can see these events happening. We keep going, thinking about in verse 6 of Ezekiel chapter 38, Gomer and the house of Togarmah. Gomer stands for an area of Western Europe. We're back to Ryazanovsky again, the history of Russia, who says that Assyrian inscriptions tell us that descendants of Gomer came to be called the Gimmerite. They were known to the Greeks as the Kimmeroi. They ruled southern Russia from roughly 1000 to 700 BC. Now you'll see the connection with what we read before. The Scythians came in and ruled that area from about 700 BC, and at that time they drove out these people and moved them across to what is today France and Germany. And so this area of Gomer, with all his bands, it says in verse 6, is this area of Western Europe, particularly German-influenced Western Europe. And Togarmah, we are told, in verse 6, is of the north quarters. Now, if you were Ezekiel, and your perspective was that of Israel, your eye was on Israel and the nation of Israel, your interest was in Israel, the north quarters, to the north, the Revised Version translates that as in the uttermost parts of the north, takes you up through Turkey into what is today the area of Georgia, and then up into Russia again. You can see on the screen there, the New American Standard Bible, the NASB, as the acronym is there, translates that as the remote parts of the north, the area immediately north of Israel. And what is the Russian influence? We could say it's more tenuous today than it has been in previous years, particularly if we're arguing that this is the area of Germany and sort of German-influenced Western Europe. And yet Russia does have an influence in that area, doesn't it? In 2018, an article was written, "How Dependent is Germany on Russian Gas?" That was July the 19th, 2018. February the 24th, 2022, an article was written with exactly the same title. How dependent is Germany on Russian gas? And it doesn't take you very, it tells you on the screen, it's a 5-minute read. It doesn't take you very long to determine that Germany is extraordinarily dependent on Russian gas. That in terms of the fuel that powers Germany, it is Russian. Russia, in its gas supplier role, cannot be replaced during the next few years, the article argues. And there are fears, aren't there, that if Russia turns off the gas, Germany isn't going to be able to continue to function. As an industrial nation, Germany absolutely relies on the natural resources that come from Russia. Germany rejects claims that it can't fulfill its contracts. That was Tuesday of last week that this was happening. Germany and Russia are not allied in the sense that they are nations friendly to each other, in the same way as Russia is with Iran, for instance, or Russia is with Ethiopia. But in terms of its dependence upon Russia, Germany and that German-influenced Western Europe are absolutely dependent. Is it reasonable that we could see Germany forced into an alliance with Russia? And I think the answer has to be yes, it is reasonable. There are other connections between the two countries. There is the possibility of friendship, although that is further away than it was with Putin acting as he is at the moment. But is it reasonable to argue that Germany could be forced into an alliance with Russia? It is reasonable to say that. Those are those who are against God, those who come against the land of Israel, the mountains of Israel, says Ezekiel chapter 38 and verse 8. But what about the other nations? Very quickly, we want to go in verse 13. Sheba and Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions thereof. In Ezekiel chapter 27, we're not going to turn there, but you can if you want, just to see that I'm telling you the truth. In Ezekiel chapter 27, we have the area of Tarshish associated with these metals: silver, iron, tin, and lead. And Herodotus tells us in his histories that of the extreme tracts of Europe towards the west, I cannot speak with any certainty. And then he does what he often does in his histories and speaks with certainty, where he says, nor do I know of any islands called the Cassiterides, whence the tin comes which we use. Nevertheless, tin and amber do certainly come to us from the ends of the earth. And so what Herodotus is sort of aiming at, if he hasn't quite got there, is that there are people who speak of what were known as the Tin Isles. And there was tin that came from them. Now, Herodotus says, I can't tell you, I don't know where they are, never been. But people spoke of those islands. And also, Herodotus says, we get tin and amber from the ends of the earth. We definitely do, we certainly do, he says. Now, if you were to look at the mines in Britain, Roman Britain particularly, but even today, you will be able to see tin mines, iron mines in the Weald over in the southeast, tin down in the southwest, lead up in Derbyshire, gold, silver, copper. All of these things taken out of the earth in this country. And Herodotus tells us, people talk about these tin islands. I can't tell you if they're true or not. But here we are, living in one today. When the Bible talks about Tarshish, it is talking about a nation who is a trading nation from which countries such as, Israel and the Phoenicians, particularly up in the north of Israel, got silver and iron, tin and lead. We aren't going to spend any more time trying to prove that Britain fits all of these things. but we're going to make the assertion that it does. Britain currently is working on making itself what it is calling Global Britain. This is the logo, the icon that they have used to show Global Britain at a time when Britain's borders, it feels, have expanded because they have come out of the European Union and made themselves a player on the global stage again. Britain is working to fulfill trading links with a variety of different nations from across the world. That slowed down a little bit with the Tory leadership contest, but is still happening. Tarshish, we are told, in Ezekiel 38 and verse 13, has young lions. Britain is a country which has claimed to itself that it has had young lions. Britain there, represented by the old lion in the poster, calls on the parts of its empire to whom it refers as the young lions. We are, the logo doesn't show up very well against the background, but we are about a week away, so less than a week away, from the Commonwealth Games that are going to happen in Birmingham. I think the opening ceremony for that is Wednesday or Thursday of next week. The Commonwealth represents those nations which mostly used to be part of the British Empire, who are still associated together with the power of Britain, whether that power has waned or not. They are still associated with that power, and that young lion aspect still exists. So what we have then is Britain and those young lions who are associated with it standing out against this Russian-led invasion force as it comes down to Israel. Art thou come to take a spoil? They ask in verse 13. And again, we ask ourselves, is this reasonable? And I think the answer is yes. One of the things that Boris Johnson tried to use to prop himself up as his government was, or at least his position within the government was failing, was his staunch defence of Ukraine against the Russians. The thing that he said in his parting speech to the Commons was, what one of the key points going forward was that Britain had to remain in opposition to Russia, specifically as it stood with its invasion of Ukraine. But can we see that it would be reasonable for Britain to take the same stance if Russia led an invasion against another country, came south from Russia into Israel? I think the answer is yes. We can absolutely see that that would be reasonable, that is something that would happen, that Britain would stand up. There is no military involvement directly from Britain, but there are a lot of words being thrown against Putin and his Ukrainian invasion. So let's revisit this sequence then. Ezekiel chapter 38 speaks to us of Russia and his Middle Eastern allies invading the land of Israel to take a spoil. Doesn't specify what the spoil is, but they are come for a purpose. They want something. Britain, with other Middle Eastern countries, we didn't go over who Sheba and Dedan were. We can talk about that afterwards if you'd like. But Britain, with other Middle Eastern countries and a collection of other allies, the Young Lions, protest, but they can't stop the invaders. God intervenes. And in the end, all nations recognize and acknowledge God. Now, do we think that this is reasonable? It's possible that 12 months ago, 6 months ago, we might not have done. There's no way that a European country would get involved in a land war. We don't live in a world where countries invade other countries in this way. Certainly not in this part of the world. But I think since the end of February, we can't but argue that this is reasonable. We live in a world in which Russia has invaded a neighbouring country. Russia has gone with a, however spurious claim it might be, and bitten a chunk out of the country next door. Ezekiel chapter 38 speaks to us of an invasion by Russia and a group of allies. And we live in a world where we can see that that is a reasonable thing for us to think will happen. And how does Ezekiel 38 finish? With the culmination of the purpose of God and the nations of the world recognizing him. If we can accept that Ezekiel 38 is giving to us, this interpretation of Ezekiel 38 shows to us a reasonable picture of what will happen in the future. Russia haven't invaded Israel yet. This isn't something which we can point to and say has already happened. This is something which we are arguing is going to happen. Then why would we doubt the conclusion of Ezekiel 38 and the promise that God makes that he will rule the world, that he will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that he is God? Now, the Bible holds out an offer for us that we can be part of that time. That even though we live through a time of fear and of difficulty, that there is a hope of a future to come. We have seen the reliability and the reasonableness of the prophecies contained within the Bible. That Ezekiel 2,500 years ago could see the state of the nations as they are today. Specifically, there is no fogginess about this prophecy. This is a prophecy which is clear and certain in the people that it's talking about and the details of the events that they will do. We can be confident that the Bible is showing to us a picture of what will happen in the future. And the conclusion of that picture is that God will rule the world. We have the opportunity to be part of that time. Let's all read our Bibles and grasp hold of that chance. Thank you.